This series is being co-sponsored by our colleagues at Harvard Alumni Travel, and we are very pleased to feature a number of speakers who have connections to both Yale and Harvard, as well as distinguished faculty from both universities. Together, we have organized 9 discussions for our collective alumni communities, which will take place over the next 3 weeks. Each discussion features experts across a wide range of topics relevant to climate change, and all the lectures will be recorded and available to view on the Yale Alumni Academy and the Harvard Alumni Travel websites. Now, this is the first of our conversation. Our second conversation will take place tomorrow, October 27th at 3 p.m. Eastern with Professor Robert Stavins of Harvard's Kennedy School. And he will be addressing the topic, what can an economist possibly have to say about climate change? If you haven't already registered for tomorrow's presentation, you can sign up via alumniacademy.yale.edu. And I was speaking with Professor Esty a little earlier, and he let me know that he and Professor Stavins are colleagues and frequently in contact. So you're in good company tomorrow if you join the presentation. But now to our guest of the day, Professor Dan Esty. He will kick it off with a focus on the current climate moment, the movement towards deep decarbonization. Dan Esty is Hillhouse Professor at Yale University with appointments at both Yale Law School and Yale School of the Environment. In addition, he is a graduate of Yale Law School as well as a graduate of Harvard College. So a very fitting person to kick off our climate change conversations. He is also director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, and co-director of the Yale Initiative on Sustainable Finance. Professor Esty has written or edited 14 books, including the prize-winning volumes Green to Gold and A Better Planet. And he's authored dozens of articles on environmental protection, regulatory reform, and sustainability, and the connections between these fields and corporate strategy, competitiveness, and international trade. Professor Esty served in various leadership roles at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency from 1989 to 1993, and as Commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection from 2011 to 2014. His most recent book is Values at Work, Sustainable Investing and ESG Reporting, published by Palgrave Macmillan. And we're pleased to offer signed copies of his book today. They can be purchased via the Yale bookstore, and we will post the link for purchasing a copy of Professor Esty's book in the chat. And now I will turn it over to Professor Dan Esty. Thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks so very much. And a special thanks to the entire Yale Alumni Academy team. And a special thanks to Harvard as well. As a graduate of both universities, it's a special pleasure to kick off this joint program. And the title does suggest that I'm going to talk about the moment we're in thinking about climate change. And I want to get to that because it is a critical moment. It may even turn out to be a watershed moment. It's also probably evident to everyone who's in this conversation today that the world community is coming together just next week in Glasgow for the so-called Conference of the Parties. For those of you who don't know, it's the Conference of the Parties to the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is the 26th time that a group has gathered. Of course, it's a chance to catch up on some lost time because there was no meeting last year as a result of the pandemic. And those parties are going to gather, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what they're going to say and do. But it is clear that they gather as signs point to the need for more urgent action on climate change. In particular, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has just released a couple of months ago its 6th assessment report. These are done periodically every 5 or 10 years, or 5 to 8 years, let's say. And this most recent report does call out the need for more urgent action and the risks of not taking action and allowing global warming and the associated effects of rising sea levels, more intense windstorms, changed rainfall patterns, more droughts in some places and fires as a result, more floods in other places, to really start to damage the planet that we all depend upon. So it is a challenging moment. And one might also look out across particularly the United States with some worry, and particularly in terms of what's going on in Washington, where we see ongoing deep political divisions, really quite bitter partisanship, dysfunction in many regards in terms of the ability to get things done at the federal government level. And even most recently in the last week or two, the climate change elements falling out of the so-called reconciliation package that the House and Senate are working to put together to try to advance some of President Biden's agenda. So it would not be unimaginable for some of you listening in to think this is a challenging moment, maybe even a moment of despair. But I'm going to argue today and try to convince you that it's actually a moment for hope, a moment even perhaps for optimism. I think the world has started to really come to grips with climate change, and that we are now moving, I think, inevitably and not quickly, but steadily towards a future that is going to be more sustainable, marked by, in particular, deep decarbonization. That is to say, the movement towards a clean energy future with a recognition that the fossil fuel world we've been in, which causes these releases in so many ways of the carbon dioxide and some of the other greenhouse gases, is receding into history. Now, that is not a for sure prediction, but I'm going to give you a line of thinking about why I believe that change is coming. And we might also say that it's not easy to predict change. In fact, one of the things that I learned most clearly in my time as head of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection is that change, especially in government, is very difficult to bring about, even when the status quo is plainly broken and not working. So change does threaten people, and people cling to the way things are, even when they realize it's not a good thing to do. But here's why I'm hopeful. And here's why I think all of you should take this moment, this climate change moment, as a time to see that we are now moving in new directions towards what I think will be a sustainable future. So first, what's going to go on in Glasgow next week and the week after? I think you're going to see a substantial re-energizing of the push for real work to address climate change. I think you're going to see a boost in the momentum for significant climate change action as the world community comes together. It's going to be one of the largest gatherings of public officials and supporting types, including people like me, as well as various NGOs and media and think tanks. 30,000 people now expected to gather in Glasgow. And of course, one big change compared to recent years is that President Biden will be there. So the US is back in the game. And I think in some regards, it's a good thing this COP26 did not take place a year ago, because it would have been under an administration in the United States not ready to take action. So I think that is, again, a positive sign. Now, what is on the agenda? What's going to be decided? And I know some of you are into these details in a big way, and others maybe not so much. But let me quickly sketch out what I see the important lines of conversation going to be and what might be expected to emerge. Number one, I think we're going to see a broad consensus, not unanimous, but as you all know, consensus doesn't mean that everyone agrees. I like to teach my students, it means that most people mostly agree, and the most important people fully agree. But that does mean you could have some outlier countries and some folks complaining about this. But I think you're going to see a new consensus that we need to have deep decarbonization, effectively net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And that's a shift from the prior Paris Accord of 2015, where the conversation at that time and the agreement expressly said there would be net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the end of the century. So we're pulling that deadline in quite a bit, I think, in Glasgow in the next couple of weeks. We're also going to have a year delay, but a 5-year stock take following on from the commitments made in 2015 at the time of the Paris Agreement. And that stock take is going to involve each country presenting their nationally determined contributions of what they're going to do to address climate change and how much emissions reduction that would create, and put those up for review. And we will find a number of countries on track, a number that are not on track. And all of them, all the countries presenting, are going to be scrutinized and urged to do more. That's clearly one of the themes of this year's gathering, is the need for greater ambition. I think you're also going to see significant conversations around how to structure carbon markets, how to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions, and really trying to think about the policy tools that need to be taken up country by country to drive transformative change, to kind of create the platform for movement to a clean energy future. Now, I think there are going to be some issues on which the conversations will be tougher, which no agreement may be reached. In particular, there's a big need to flow a great deal more capital towards the clean energy infrastructure that needs to be built all over the world, repurposing of some infrastructure in the developed world, but creation of the foundation for a modern energy economy in much of the developing world. Now, one of the points of concern is that the Paris Agreement did say that the US and other countries in the developed world would help to mobilize $100 billion per year of capital to support the developing world's shift toward a clean energy future. And that was an important part of that Paris Agreement. And in doing so, that commitment helped bring many of the developing countries that had been sitting on the sidelines into the Paris Agreement. So we ended up at the time in 2015 with 195 countries signing on to the agreement and 189 of them producing these nationally determined contributions, their own climate change action plans. And that was a big change from the prior structure of these international climate change agreements, which had separated the world into an Annex 1 list of countries that were committed to taking action, 44 in number, and the rest of the world, 150 or so in number, that were in fact allowed to sit on the sidelines. That turned out to be a very bad structure and really explains a lot of the lack of progress from 1992, frankly, to about 2015. So I do think we're going to see action on the part of many countries, commitments being upped on the part of many countries, but probably disagreement on that finance target, because it does look like the world community is falling short of the $100 billion commitment. There seems to be something like $80 billion last year that did get mobilized to support this shift to a clean energy future, but there is a gap. And some developing countries feel like the commitment wasn't just to mobilize, but was actually to put up official government aid at that total of $100 billion. A second issue that will be contentious is the so-called loss and damage provision. The loss and damage provision is a push from some of the developing countries to be allowed to claim for a loss, have a liability conclusion that those who caused the emissions in the past should be liable to pay for the losses and damages, particularly in the least developed countries. I don't think you'll see agreement on that. The US, in fact, will not agree to it. The other thing that I think is interesting is that there has long been a difficulty in figuring out who should do what in response to climate change, who needs to take what action, and who should pay for it. But I think we've made progress in recent years around the core framing of that question, which is sometimes talked about as burden sharing. But the concept that gets a lot of attention is the idea of common but differentiated responsibility. For those who are in this field, you'll see the acronym CBDR a great deal. In fact, climate negotiators love acronyms. I'm going to try to avoid them, and please push me if I use one that you don't understand. But this idea of common but differentiated responsibility, I think for a long time divided countries, because a great number of countries said, well, we're differentiated. We don't need to take action. I think as of the 2015 Paris Agreement, the focus shifted to the word common, and that everyone understood there was a common obligation to protect planet Earth. And we, of course, have differentiated starting points, but everybody getting into the game and taking on responsibilities was a big breakthrough at the time of the Paris Agreement. So my number one reason for optimism is I think the world community is coming back together, and there's going to be momentum rising from Glasgow that helps us imagine that we're headed for a clean energy future and gets people thinking about what that's going to require. Second, I think we are starting to see some light at the end of the pandemic tunnel. A number of countries and a number of organizations are talking about how to build the economy back. In fact, the slogan that we see in America, Build Back Better, is also echoed in Britain, where Prince Charles has been talking about Build Back Better. And really of leaders all over the world and organizations like the World Economic Forum. And almost everyone in saying we need to build back better cites sustainability as what needs to be done differently and better. We need to create an economy that is more sustainable out over time, that protects critical resources and really works to ensure that we don't transgress planetary boundaries, the most critical of which and obvious of which is the potential buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But the sustainability agenda is broader. It includes water use, the draining of aquifers in some places, water contamination, chemical exposures, the buildup of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers and runoff that are causing eutrophication. So it includes the chlorofluorocarbons that have been breaking down the ozone layer. So we really do want to have attention to the planetary boundaries that define the safe operating space within Earth systems. This, by the way, is work that's been done in a number of places, but particularly by Johann Rockström, who now heads the Potsdam Institute in Germany. And I do think the importance of that and the need to build an economy that reflects it is being taken up in countries all over the world as they push to come out the other side of the pandemic. So the fact that during the pandemic, interest in sustainability did not fall away as I thought it might, which often happens in an economic downturn, but rather increased. And we come out the far side potentially of this pandemic more centered on sustainability is, I think, another reason for hope and optimism. Third on my list is the broader, I think, rising consciousness around the need to focus on what I've called the sustainability imperative. I think sustainability needs to be understood as a cornerstone of life in the 21st century, as kind of a absolute foundational element of what it's going to take to make this century one that promotes further flourishing of humans, not only in America, but across the world. And I do think the recognition of that sustainability imperative is growing. It's the centerpiece of the book that I edited with authors from across the Yale School of the Environment, including, in fact, all the authors across all of Yale and some from beyond Yale, that came out a year and a half ago called A Better Planet, 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. And I think what it articulates is that we do need to take seriously this idea of environmental protection and energy moving towards a clean and renewable future in a very serious way. And I think this idea that sustainability should be a starting point for how we lead our lives is actually one that the young folks, the folks that I teach, don't have any doubt about. They say it's obvious. And in fact, what I think you see with people like Greta Thunberg, who's been protesting, as some of you know, Fridays for now several years, Greta's normal focus is how the governments in power, the leaders in power, don't get it, but young people do, that we need to be much more attentive to sustainability. But I think that as a new norm for life is emerging. I think, in fact, we're starting to see a reality, which is that people don't think it's okay to spill environmental harms out of a business or in any way onto others. And I have been actually developing a thesis behind this, an argument that we really must reground environmental law and policy on the idea that no environmental spillovers from one place to another, from one entity onto the rest of the community are acceptable. And I've just written this up in a just released last week NYU Environmental Law Journal article called the End Externalities Manifesto. It's done with my colleague Don Elliott, and it basically makes the case for regrounding environmental protection on this idea that no pollution should be acceptable, Not that we're going to end all pollution, but we can end pollution that's not paid for. And we can set as a standard the idea that zero pollution should be the target and that companies should be held to getting to that target quite quickly. And if there are some residual emissions, they should pay for them fully. And Don Elliott and I argue that they should pay not only for the harm they cause, but to the people that have to bear that harm, to the victims. So this is a quite dramatic shift, perhaps, in how environmental law might be undertaken. But again, as I lay it out in front of audiences of younger people, they are all surprised that we don't already have that law. And I think it does raise the question about why we have for so long accepted that there was an inevitable set of pollution harms associated with industrial activity. I think for a long time, more than 100 years, people have assumed that the goods we got from industry were so valuable that it justified a degree of harm. I don't think that's true going forward. And by the way, for the economists in the audience, and you can push Rob Stavens to talk about this more tomorrow, this would be a shift away from a Calder-Hicks model, where we look at the net social benefits of an industry and say if their benefits are greater than the burdens they put on society, they should be allowed to go forward. What I would argue, and Don Elliott and I argue in our recent piece, is that's not a good framework. We should, in fact, return to what we sometimes call the Pigouvian Framework, which would be to say that that industry should be gauged for its net social benefit. But to the extent there are burdens, are pollution costs or other environmental harms inflicted on society, those should be paid for fully. And not just hypothetically, we calculate whether the benefits are greater than the cost. We should make the polluting enterprise, the environmentally damaging enterprise, pay for its harms. And by the way, this is not anything radical or new. It really is to just take seriously a 500-year tradition, not only in American, but in Anglo-American law, tracing back to the 1500s in Britain. In fact, the classic case that any of you who are lawyers may have actually studied in a tort class or even a property class is a case from 1610 called Aldred's case, where a neighbor complained about the pigsty next door. And the court said, yes, that pigsty is a nuisance and it's not acceptable. And it either has to stop or there's going to have to be damages paid. And that's the principle that Don Elliott and I have argued for. Pollution should stop or the harm caused should be fully compensated for. And I do think this reflects a broader principle that's now emerging in our society, a principle that privatized gains at the expense of costs that are borne by society are no longer okay. And that any company with a business model that depends on sending smoke up a smokestack or effluent out a pipe into a nearby river or greenhouse gases into the atmosphere should anticipate that that's not okay going forward. It should be minimized as a harm, and to the extent any residual harm is unavoidable and the value of the business is so great that we want to allow it to go forward, that there will be full compensation paid. Now, again, this might seem like a departure from the current world for many, but I think the business world is already largely getting to this as the reality for business going forward, as a new baseline for what businesses should expect to be called upon to do. And I point in particular to the Business Roundtable, that collection of CEOs of some of America's biggest companies, who a couple of years ago issued a new statement of purpose of a corporation. And in it, they said, in effect, that the old world of shareholder primacy, going back to the Milton Friedman doctrine that companies should seek to maximize profits for their owners, so long as what they were doing was not illegal. And that is being replaced, I think, broadly, and certainly the Business Roundtable statement of purpose suggests this, by a sense that corporations should take on a view of themselves as having a stakeholder responsibility, owing duties to their suppliers, their customers, their employees, the communities they operate in, and into society more broadly. And I think that does require businesses to reflect on how they do business and what they produce. And there really will be a reckoning coming for companies that have business models that, as I say, depend upon, for their profitability, for their ongoing success, imposing harms on society, whether that's pollution or otherwise. So I think it is now the case that we are moving towards a world that no longer says businesses are so valuable that we should take for granted that some degree of harm will be flowing from their activities. I think instead there is a recognition we should end those externalities and move to a world where business is expected to be clean, and with some modest exceptions, that's the starting point for environmental law. Now that brings me to my fourth point. I think the business world is already taking up corporate sustainability in a big way. I think the fact is that a lot of companies are working hard on sustainability agendas, have appointed chief sustainability officers, have invested in cleaning up their pollution and reducing their harms. And I think they recognize the need for better alignment with society's goals. And the fact is, this is part of what's sometimes called the social license to operate. It's of course not a real license, but it's alignment between business practices and public expectations. And those expectations, I think, do now include a commitment to take seriously this sustainability imperative. And that really leads me to a subset of this question of corporate sustainability and the topic of the book that Lauren mentioned at the outset, values at work. And what I think you see is that businesses are being pressed not only by broad societal changing norms, not only by government commitments, including what will come out of Glasgow next week, and a number of countries that will put in place laws and regulations to implement a commitment to deep decarbonization. But I think you see a rising world of sustainable investing as another significant vector for pressure on companies to be sustainable and to take seriously not only the broad sustainability imperative, but the need to reduce dramatically their greenhouse gas emissions. And this pressure comes not from a thin slice of socially responsible investors, as was the case perhaps a decade or two ago, but frankly from a rising dimension of mainstream investors who are saying that they want better alignment between their values and their portfolios. And as a result, they want to know more about the companies in their portfolios, particularly about the environmental, social, and governance performance of those companies, which gives rise to this idea of ESG reporting. And there is, of course, a lot of data out in the marketplace about the environmental performance of companies on several different dimensions, a growing set of metrics being developed around the social performance of companies, how they do with respect to issues like diversity in the workplace, what's the gender balance of their management team, are they investing in human resources to ensure that their employees are well taken care of. A lot of these issues are being now tracked, engaged, but not in a particularly good way. There's not a lot of comparability across the different metrics that are provided by, in many cases, external, that is to say, not within the company, but third-party data aggregators, companies like MSCI or Sustainalytics, and there are many others, Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters. All of these folks are doing various kinds of ESG metrics creation, gathering, collating. And I think what you're starting to see is a demand from investors for better metrics and a better ability to track who is really delivering on the sustainability imperative and who's not. And frankly, not only who's lagging, but especially to unmask those that are greenwashing. They're telling a story that when you look behind the curtain doesn't turn out to be true. And I think it's not only investors, but investment managers that have taken up this push for a clearer picture of who the real sustainability leaders are, who's helping move us to a sustainable future, who's turning out to be innovative in terms of this push towards clean energy, and really who are problem solvers, which companies are putting solutions into the marketplace. And I do think, again, it's not just investors, but now investment managers, folks like Larry Fink at BlackRock, really starting to insist that companies be more attentive to this agenda and certainly to report on it. And then there are folks really helping to mobilize shareholder pressure. Companies like Hermes that works to really bring sustainability into sharp focus at the company level. And by the way, it's not just investors, although that's the core theme of this Values at Work book, but it turns out that it's not just investors, but also customers that care about the performance of the companies whose products they buy. So this ESG metrics matrix is of interest not only to investors, but to many customers who want to buy greener products, perhaps more organic food, a whole range of better performing products that have a sustainability dimension built into them. So this importance of getting better data, better facts on corporate sustainability performance enhances the ability of customers as well as investors to separate leaders from laggards, and frankly, to understand what the sustainability possibilities are in the marketplace. And I think there's a third element of this pressure building on companies, and that is from employees. A growing number of folks want purpose in their jobs, in their professional lives. I see it virtually in all of my Yale students. And I think the battle for talent is proving to be one of the most critical elements for competitive advantage in the corporate world in the 21st century. So companies can't afford to be seen as on the wrong side of sustainability, or they won't get any of the super talented knowledge workers that are the key to future business success. So I think that rising set of lines of pressure on the corporate world to be sustainable, to take seriously the sustainability imperative, is really making a difference in advance of, and perhaps regardless of, whether there is any legal requirement or regulatory structure behind that commitment to a better environmental future. And that actually brings me to the fifth point that I think is worth noting as we look out at why the world might be turning a corner toward a sustainable future, toward deep decarbonization, despite the challenges that I outlined at the very beginning of my talk. And that is, I think you're starting to see lots of folks in different places getting serious about pathways to deep decarbonization. Again, roughly meaning getting to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. And I think it's certainly the case that governments are starting to work on this. I've spent time briefing the Department of Energy on some of the work I've been doing on deep decarbonization, in particularly something called America's Zero Carbon Action Plan that I helped develop with almost 100 researchers, scholars, policy experts across the United States, led by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that's a creation of Jeff Sachs at Columbia. And in that exercise, we really mapped out what would be required to get the United States to net zero greenhouse gas emissions with economic modeling behind it. And we looked at 6 critical sectors that have to be fundamentally transformed, first being power generation. But that's actually the sector that's moved farthest along. There's a lot of renewable power, clean and renewable power now on the US electricity grid. The second sector that's got to evolve are buildings. A lot of heating is still done with on-site fossil fuel burning. And we think that what's required there is broad-scale electrification. So heat pumps and moving not just air conditioning, but heating to electric. And of course, then having behind that clean and renewable electricity to power those heat pumps. A third sector is transportation, where again, I think you now see a dramatic shift towards electrification of cars and trucks going forward. Every day, new stories come out. We'll just pick today's headline to give you an example. Tesla now going to be a major supplier of vehicles to Hertz. Roughly 20% of that rental fleet will be an electric vehicle Tesla within the next couple of years. So dramatic shifts. And for those who didn't want to or didn't see that story, perhaps you saw the full-page ad purchased in the Wall Street Journal in the past week by Polestar, the electric vehicle element within Volvo. So you've got lots of signals that the business world, the auto world in particular, is moving towards an electric future. A fourth, of course, is industry, heavy industry in particular, tough to decarbonize in some cases, but there will be a lot of electrification going on. And then a special focus in this ZCAP study that I did, the Zero Carbon Action Plan, around tough to decarbonize sectors, steel, aviation, cement. Those are sectors that will take some further innovation, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. 2 final sectors that got a lot of attention because they're critical to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions future One is land use, and particularly the need for sustainable agriculture. And I do think farming and ranching is being transformed. There is a recognition that there are current practices that can't go on, but a recognition that a real change is possible and now needed. And finally, materials. I think there is a recognition we need more closed loops. We need a circular economy when much more in the way of material is recaptured and recycled so that we are not having as much waste. Because of course, waste is a problem if you really want a sustainable future. So all of that, I think, adds up to, in very fundamental ways, an agenda for change and the prospect that real change is coming. And I guess I want to just point out two more things. One is that we are going to need to have special efforts put into the hard to decarbonize sectors. This is one of the conclusions from that ZCAP study. And we are going to need to particularly think about things like hydrogen. And that is got some potential, particularly if it is green hydrogen that comes from electrolysis, that is to say, breaking apart water to extract hydrogen and separate it from the oxygen. And that requires a lot of electricity to do it. But if you have a clean source of electricity, it could be a way to get hydrogen as a fuel for aviation or for potentially some of these other high heat intensity demanding industries like steel or cement. The other point I just want to kind of draw a line under as I look at these pathways that are being developed. And by the way, the work done by the Zero Carbon Action Plan team is just one of a number of studies. There's a team at Princeton that's done a big study, which given that we're Harvard and Yale, we probably should at least acknowledge Princeton is in this conversation too. But also the national academies have done a study on what's required for a clean energy electric future. There's been work done at Berkeley and a number of other universities painting out the picture of what's required for a net zero emissions future. And I think what all of those studies come to is a conclusion that there's a lot we know how to do, and therefore a lot of paths we should be going down already. But there is also some degree that we don't yet have a clear sort of vision of how to get to. And the ZCAP study, I would tell you, is a roughly 80% agenda. It's got about 80% view, line of sight on what's required for deep decarbonization. But the conclusion that we come to, and that others do as well, is we're going to need innovation. Now that brings me to my sixth and next to final point. I think we do gain a lot by recognizing the importance of innovation. And actually, I would tell you why I'm optimistic is there is so much effort being put into clean energy innovation and more broadly, sustainability innovation. So the need for new ways to think about problems, fresh ideas, creativity, harnessing of the enormous innovation capacity of not only the United States, but the creative spirits all across the world, and the funding of entrepreneurs and innovators to run with these ideas and try to commercialize them has been recognized. And I think you see money now flowing in many directions towards environmental problem solving, sustainability solutions development. And in that regard, I think we have to recognize that the innovation that's required is not simply developing better wind turbines and solar arrays. Yes, we need more cost-effective, clean and renewable power sources, for sure. But I like to say we need innovation more broadly. We need supporting technologies. We need better batteries and storage of electricity. Again, more cost-effectively so that we can shave the peak of our current demand structure for electricity, and also ensure that the intermittency of solar power and wind power doesn't become a burden, requiring us to stay with fossil fuels for a much longer time than we might otherwise need to. I think we also need a smarter grid and better transmission that doesn't have as much in the way of line losses, and smart homes and smart appliances, all of which, again, are opportunities for innovation. I think we also need much more innovation in finance, how we're going to flow this vast amount of capital that's required to build out the clean energy future, to build out the sustainability dimension of the remaking of virtually every enterprise, every industry, not only across our country, but around our world. So that I do think is going to require, again, some creativity, and we see it coming with new emphasis on green bonds. Just this week, Marcia McLennan and some others announcing a green insurance program with premiums for companies that have particularly good ESG ratings. So I think we're seeing those incentives, and we're seeing creative structures like the Green Bank that Connecticut was able to set up while I was the commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. That Green Bank model was picked up by New York and now by about a dozen other states and countries all around the world, using a mix of limited government money to leverage private capital to really deliver on society's needs. And I think that mixed finance model is very important. And beyond all of that, we're going to need innovative policy frameworks that create incentives to drive change, to incentivize people to step up to this transformative moment where we really do need to change virtually every business model across every company in every industry. And I think we are seeing some of those tools emerge. A lot of countries have adopted what sometimes we call carbon pricing, which is, of course, really greenhouse gas emissions harm charges, making people pay for the harm associated with the burning of fossil fuels or anything else that creates greenhouse gas emissions. This, of course, is the sort of work that my Yale colleague, Bill Nordhaus, won the Nobel Prize for. And I think it is starting to percolate beyond the kind of an economics community into the broader society, and particularly into policy conversations in many places. Sadly, not so much in the United States, although more at the state level than the federal level. And finally, we need innovative partnerships. We really need to think about ways to bring others into this push for innovation and the push to create the solutions we need for our sustainable future. And I'm very pleased that both Harvard and Yale in recent weeks, never mind months, have stepped up and really made new commitments to being part of that provision of solutions for a sustainable future. Yale, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, launched a new fundraising campaign, the overarching slogan of which is "For Humanity." And I think that is a kind of action commitment and to really a problem-solving commitment. That's a great overarching theme for this Yale fundraising effort. And frankly, one of the core themes under that is planetary solutions. The first time I'm aware of that any kind of environmental agenda made it into the top tier of Yale's development strategy. So from my point of view, all good news and another reason to be optimistic. My final point, I think the world is starting to recognize the importance of environmental rights as fundamental, as in effect, human rights. And I've been working on this issue as well and arguing that environmental rights should be seen as natural rights, not something governments create, but are fundamental to who we are. The right to breathe clean air, to drink safe water is something that is so fundamental to human existence that it shouldn't be debated as to whether it needs legal protection. And by the way, 149 countries have written into their constitutions some form of a right to a healthy environment, framed in different ways, but with that spirit behind it. And the United States, of course, has an old constitution, so we don't have that kind of a right, but we could read it into our constitution, as we've read in the past, civil rights into the existing structure, the right to marriage equality into the existing structure. I think it's time to read into our Constitution a fundamental commitment, perhaps in the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One could find a legal framework that says environmental rights need to be taken seriously. And this, of course, aligns with the push for environmental justice. It aligns with the idea that we shouldn't be allowing people to spill harms or companies to spill harms on others. And although the cases in the US trying to seek vindication for environmental rights have not moved forward, cases like the Kivalina case or the Juliana case that we might talk about in our questions and answer time, these kind of cases have moved forward in places like France, where the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel have both decided, not one, but several cases in the last couple of years, vindicating environmental rights, insisting on both companies and the government doing more to address problems, particularly climate change. Similar cases in the Netherlands, the Urgenda case, where the government was ordered to do more. And just this last year, the Shell case where the court ordered Shell to deeply decarbonize on a much faster pace than they might have otherwise done themselves. Courts in Germany, Supreme Court level courts in Germany and the United Kingdom have made similar decisions in recent years. And likewise, it's not only a European or a developed country legal direction, jurisprudential direction, but similar case decisions have come out in India, in Pakistan, in Nigeria, in Ecuador, in Colombia. And I think even above and beyond that, there is a push led, in fact, by the head of the Constitutional Court in France, Laurent Fabius, who, by the way, was also the chair as foreign minister of France of the 2015 Paris climate negotiations. But he's pushing for a global pact for the environment. I think that would be a good thing to do, a way to consolidate the reality of environmental rights needing to be taken more seriously. So I close by saying that I think the world is at a challenging moment, is, I hope, at a watershed moment. I think we are turning the corner to a decarbonized future, a sustainable future. I think the conference in Glasgow, this COP26, over the first 12 days of November, will help build the momentum for that change. But the kind of change required is big. Transformative change, as I've said, for many industries, some of which may be quite jarred. The fact that we now have a lot of conversation about what a just transition looks like and how we take account of and really deal with the fact there will be individuals whose livelihoods have to change, communities that will be jarred as the fossil fuel economies they depended on go away. And I do think that we're serious about this just transition is important, but it's still, no matter what we say, going to be a big deal as we change the underpinnings of our economy to make it a clean energy foundation. And I do think it's going to require a great deal of work by almost everyone, including many of you on this call. But I think that alignment of industry interest with a sustainable future is emerging. I think what we see now is signs that the smart money is betting on this transformative change happening. And I'll give you just one clear signal, although there are many more. One can see the fact that ExxonMobil's 3 management candidates for director just a couple of months ago lost a shareholder vote, and 3 outside directors were elected who were committed to transformative change in the oil industry, and particularly within ExxonMobil. So again, I think you don't win one of those shareholder votes for director positions unless you've got a majority of smart money with you. So I see smart money moving, and that's why I think this Values at Work book and its argument about how capital flows and the power of sustainable investing could be the force that really drives change alongside of, or perhaps ahead of, governments, that gives us the sustainable future that I think so many believe is essential for not just economic success going forward, but human flourishing. So with that, I'll say thank you to you all for signing in today. I look forward to taking up some of your questions and to moving into a conversation.
Thank you, Professor Esty. I will just ask if you can mute, that way there's no echo. And we have we have nearly 300 people on the call, and we have about 27 questions. So plenty of conversation to be had. We have about a half an hour to have it in. Thank you all. If you would please put your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat. That allows me to keep track of what questions have been asked and answered so that I can try to get to as many of them as possible. I also just want to acknowledge the wide variety of types of people that we have. I was so impressed reading all of your introductions. We have teachers, we have academics, we have policy leaders, we have activists, we have people from think tanks, we have lawyers. We really run the gamut. We have a nice contingent from the Yale Divinity School here. So we really run the gamut. And I want to give a special shout out to Maria Ivanova, who is Professor Esty's first PhD student and now a professor at UMass Boston. Hi, Maria. Thanks for introducing yourself earlier. I also want to encourage all of you to please sign up for the the upcoming sessions of our climate change conversations, the next of which is tomorrow at 3 o'clock. You can find out about all of the sessions. There are 9 in total, including today's, at alumniacademy.yale.edu, where you can register for them and where you will find the recordings of these sessions after they are over. So don't fret if you can't make one. You can watch it on demand when the session is over. Without further ado, I'm going to go to what is now 34 questions and try to get to as many of them as I can. I want to start with Michelle's question. What is the plan to support research concerning climate change and the environment within low and middle income countries? Research institutions and researchers from these countries are needed if we want to achieve a lasting global impact.
So it's a great question. And Michelle, you're quite right in the implication of the question, which is that we won't achieve transformative change. We won't bring all the world along to a sustainable future and to deep decarbonization if we leave the developing world out. And there's a particular tension and challenge because at the lowest end of the economic spectrum, a low end of economic development, there are many countries that still face energy poverty, where people don't even have access to modern energy services, notably electricity. So there's going to need to be a recognition that those countries are going to invest in building some degree of energy infrastructure, probably having some emissions rise in the short term. But the key for all of us is they build out a clean and renewable energy foundation. So electricity, not from burning coal or diesel, which has perhaps been the common choice in the past, but really electricity from the cleanest possible sources available, which could be solar power. A number of these countries are actually in quite sunny places. It could be hydropower. A number of them have significant hydropower potential. And it could be that they will have wind turbines because a number of them are in places where the wind could be captured. So all of that is to say that we do need not only to think about what's going to be required for a clean energy future in the developing world, but to engage researchers there in thinking about how to align what's required from a global perspective with local considerations and local needs. And I think the failure to do that in the past has been one of the reasons for, frankly, the slow pace of progress on this agenda, really over 3 decades.
Okay, speaking of coal, we've got a few people asking questions about coal. I want to go first to the questions about coal overseas. Someone has asked, isn't China burning increased amounts of coal as we speak? And is China attending the Glasgow conference? And I'll pair that with the question from Bob, how much is the sustainability imperative point of view present in the 20 to 45-year-old emerging leaders in China, India, South Africa, Egypt, Brazil, Malaysia, etc.? Is there any data about this?
Lauren, that's a great set of questions. And let me start by saying, yes, China is burning more coal, opening more coal-fired power plants. So that's a pretty bad signal in some regards of China's seriousness of purpose about being part of the global agenda. On the other hand, China did sign on to the Paris Agreement, did commit to a quite significant nationally determined contribution. Again, that's the term of art within the Paris Agreement for each country's individual action plan. And China is burning a lot of coal, but it's also become the world's leading wind power and solar power producer. So there is a lot of kind of mixed signals from China. And I would say that the leadership in China has really said it wants to be part of the clean energy future. It recently committed to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2060. So not on the agenda or the timetable that most people think is necessary, 2050, but not far off of that. And China has committed to stop having its emissions grow by 2030 or sooner. They actually have recently started adding the or sooner to their 2030 commitment. So I think that China is a complicated story, but is not outside the game. In fact, is very much in the middle of the game. And if anything, I would say that China, as a matter of industrial policy, and it's consistent with their command economy, made huge investments in and resource commitments at the state level and the industry level and the corporate level to building out technologies that will be the cornerstone of the clean energy future. So no one's putting more into battery development, into electric vehicle development, into wind turbines, into solar arrays. So China is on both sides of this right now. Their current electricity grid is very dirty, lots of coal, but they're certainly building towards the future. There will be Chinese representatives at Glasgow for this COP26, although the Chinese president has indicated he will not attend. So again, a mixed picture. And in terms of the emerging leaders, I think, and this is a striking feature that I already mentioned briefly with regard to students at Yale, and that is that the young folks are almost all deeply committed to this sustainability imperative, to the idea that environmental rights are human rights, are natural rights, and should be taken seriously. And I say that with a recognition that the students I teach are significant numbers developing country students. Lots of Chinese students, lots of Indian students, some significant number from Africa and other parts of the developing world. And I would say what is quite impressive to me is how universal this belief in a clean energy future is and the need for deep decarbonization. 10 years ago, I would have told you lots of students would come and say, poverty alleviation is our first priority. We can't afford clean energy. And I don't hear that very much anymore. I think people recognize, especially when you're building energy infrastructure, you're buying power production infrastructure that may last 40 or 50 years. You can't afford today to bet wrong on that and have what you're building be put out of business in 10 or 20 years. So I think there is really a big commitment to change. And frankly, a number of developing countries are starting to recognize their potential, A, as good places, good venues for clean energy. Again, a lot of solar power potential in a number of these countries. And B, there is a growing, I think, appreciation that some of the gap to be closed to get to net zero emissions will have to be done by carbon capture. By the way, when we talk about net zero greenhouse gases, why we call it net zero is because the emissions won't be zero, but there will be enhanced greenhouse gas emissions capture, carbon capture, or sometimes we call it greenhouse gas emissions uptake. And traditionally, the focus in that regard has been on photosynthesis and the power of green plants to absorb carbon, and therefore the value of tree planting and reforestation, or even afforestation, expanding forest cover, and certainly to prevent deforestation. But I think we now recognize there may need to be, in addition to all of that, which we sometimes describe as nature-based solutions, a need for engineered carbon capture, sometimes being discussed now as carbon removal. And this is the idea we would actually take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and hold on to it. It may be precipitated into a solid or in some way injected deep underground to hold it so it doesn't enter the atmosphere. And for those who are interested, Yale is itself making a major push forward with a new carbon capture center. And this is part of that planetary solutions agenda that Yale is really building out. So I think we are going to need to address the possibility of carbon capture. And again, a number of developing countries will be on the front lines with forest resources that could be enhanced, and perhaps even broader opportunities to be building out that carbon capture element that's going to be required for a net zero greenhouse gas emissions world by 2050.
I just want to pull out a point for clarification that Jim asked. Please define deep decarbonization.
Great question, and it is a bit of a jargon term, and I thought I might have defined it in passing, but let me highlight what that means. So decarbonization is the idea we're moving away from an economy that has a great deal of greenhouse gas emissions. Again, we sometimes speak in the climate change arena a little bit loosely about carbon and greenhouse gases, which are not the same. Carbon dioxide is, by the way, the largest part of the greenhouse gas emissions problem, roughly 75 or 80%. But methane is a greenhouse gas. Chlorofluorocarbons that are also breaking down the ozone layer, although largely controlled now, are greenhouse gases. We've got some industrial gases that have historically been part of the problem. So we really do want to be precise to say we want net zero greenhouse gases by 2050. And that's when we say deep decarbonization, we're really talking about dramatic reduction of carbon dioxide, but all greenhouse gases heading for net zero by 2050.
Okay, and I want to. There were a few questions that came in about international, destinations or locations and their contributions. But really, a lot of your work focuses on the domestic agenda. So I want to bring it back to that by pointing out one of the facts that is in some of the documents that you shared. And I encourage everyone to look in the chat and also to look in the Alumni Academy webpage. The link to your talk has links to documents that you've shared. One of the points that you make is the cost of transitioning to zero emissions in 2050 is 0.4% of GDP. So basically, for less than half of 1% of the 2050 GDP, we could shift to clean energy. And I bring that up because a lot of people have asked questions about how do you get taxpayers to agree to shift to clean energy? How do you deal with, one of the questions is places like West Virginia and Wyoming, who were just sort of staunchly against some of these clean energy policies because of the impact that it would have in the short term on their economies. And how do you transition people who are employed by industries that would be eliminated through this zero emissions plan?
So those are really important questions, and go to what I was mentioning right at the end of my talk, the importance of a just transition. And I think this, as I mentioned briefly, is an underattended to, or historically underattended to, critical element of a successful climate change strategy. And I think there are actually multiple layers of that just transition that need to be taken seriously. Layer number one is, as the question, Lauren, you offered up suggests, the communities, in some cases the entire states, that have been very fossil fuel dependent for their economic success. West Virginia, of course, some of the places where fracking is being done to get natural gas and tight oil. So that's North Dakota, it's Texas, it's Oklahoma, it's parts of Pennsylvania. And the truth is there will be some counties, some communities very seriously affected by this push away from fossil fuels. And I think we need a concerted strategy in the United States, but others need it around the world, to ensure that those communities, and particularly the individuals jarred by the transition, are given help. And I think failure to attend to that is a serious problem. I would argue that there is a further dimension of a just transition in the United States for rural America. It turns out that our most rural states are also some of our most high carbon emissions, high greenhouse gas emission states, because people drive long distances, and they may, in fact, have a lot of heating and air conditioning. So we need to make sure that people whose lives are going to seemingly be disrupted are helped along. And this, of course, also argues for helping those at the lowest end of our income spectrum. If we're going to use price signals and charges for greenhouse gas emissions, there will be some burden on everyone, and that burden will be felt most harshly by those who are least able to pay. So we're going to need some help for those folks. And that, of course, is only the domestic just transition agenda. A similar set of questions needs to be asked about those out across the world, in the developing world, the low end of the developing world in particular, about how we engage them and ensure that the transition that we want everyone to go through is one that they get support to do, including help getting those clean energy alternatives built, as opposed to adopting fossil fuel power generation.
Okay, a number of questions coming in on about your optimism. So several people thanking you for your optimism and saying that they feel really encouraged by that, and other people questioning your optimism. I'll go with Sandra's question. How do you sustain optimism when we've just seen that Congress can't pass a law that would have included requirements for cleaner electric power? It's clear there's a huge disconnect between the political parties about the urgency of decarbonization in the US, and the recent events in Congress have been disappointing. And a number of people have kind of made a similar point.
So I try to acknowledge that there are reasons that one could be discouraged. And I think the political dysfunction, particularly at the federal level, particularly in the United States, is worthy of real worry and is a reason to be disheartened. I would be the first to acknowledge that. And I guess my answer is that if I thought that the only mechanism by which transformative change could be brought about is government and only the federal government, I would be distressed. But I think what I hope to have sketched out over the last hour was a whole set of additional lines of activity and even the sort of points of leverage for driving change. And I do think the fact that you've got young people aligned in favor of a clean energy future, of a sustainable future, of the need for urgent deep decarbonization, urgent being over the next 20 years, 30 years, I think that's powerful. I think the important role of consumers and the customers of companies, pressuring those companies to do things differently and better, is a powerful point of leverage. And then again, the sort of centerpiece of my beyond government optimism is the role of investors. And I think what you see, as I tried to signal, that there is now a substantial part of the investing public, mainstream investors, not willing to sacrifice returns for their values, but really committed to change, that has now got, I think, the investment world driving towards a sustainable future, led by some very big players who I think are hard to push back against. And they are the ones that are really, I think, moving us rapidly towards the transformation that's required. And my fundamental optimism is from where I perceive the smart money to be going today, which is behind the companies that are transitioning to a clean energy foundation, that are rethinking their business models and preparing for success in a deeply decarbonized future, in a clean energy future. And I do think the companies that are not on that agenda are facing shareholder pressure. And as I mentioned with ExxonMobil, in some cases, shareholder revolts. I have to tell you, I was shocked that a set of investors in an oil company would toss out the management directors in favor of new directors whose promise was to force the company to rethink its business model in a fundamental way. If the ExxonMobil shareholders are willing to do that kind of commitment to change, I think there's hope for every company being able to think its way through to transformation. And of course, not all will get there, and some will fail. But Lauren, you pointed out something else that's important. Some careful economic analysis underpinning this Zero Carbon Action Plan, or ZCAP, that I mentioned, suggests that yes, there is a cost, about 0.4% of GDP. That's not trivial. It is substantial. But by the way, it's accompanied by several million new jobs. So there's a lot of job growth potential here. And frankly, the transition sectors that we're going to need to work on are pretty small in many regards. I think there's only 30,000 coal miners left in this country. So one can do something to help those folks along, move them to new economic opportunities. And I think that that's where the commitment's got to be made. I do think this is not an easy shift, not an easy transition, but there are pathways now. And I think the economic modeling behind those pathways suggest the costs are not trivial, but they are not overwhelming. And there is potential upside as well as new industries emerge, new jobs emerge. And frankly, I think the key to whether that new job opportunity is big or small is in part a question of the policy and whether the US is committed to really running out in front and using its great innovation strength to recapture the lead in solar power, wind power, all these other supporting technologies, batteries, storage, smart grids, smart homes, smart appliances. And we have not been systematically investing in a policy framework that drives funding in that direction, drives creativity, encourages people to invest in making those changes happen. And I think we can do better as a society, better certainly as a country in that regard.
So you spoke about investing, and I want to go to Annie's question. She wants to know, how do you, if you're an investor, how do you identify reliable source of information about where to invest your money. She asks about the website Fossil Free Funds and wants to know if there are any good raters of ESG, so that she can find a sort of a neutral source for ratings.
So Annie, I have to tell you, I've spent a lot of time on the question of ESG ratings. And if you take a look at this Values at Work book, my chapters in that book, several of them, highlight how disappointing the current framework of ESG data is. It's a very poor framework. A lot of those metrics are not well constructed. As I mentioned, a lot of the data is collected from different sources in different ways without methodological consistency and therefore without good comparability. It makes it very hard to benchmark and really know who the leaders are, who the laggards are. So I think there's work to be done on getting us better structure of ESG metrics that really serve the needs of the investing public, serve people like you. And I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will see fit to have the Securities and Exchange Commission lay out a new structure of mandatory ESG reporting. And by the way, it's not just the categories of metrics, it's the methodologies underneath them. You need to have people reporting consistently so we can really make clear who the leaders are, who the laggards are. And I've also come to believe we probably need some new aggregation of the different ratings to understand who's got the right numbers and who doesn't. Because I think a big disagreement now across these different data providers, as I was mentioning, the MSCIs, the Sustainalytics, the Bloombergs. If you look at the correlation across those different data providers, it's very poor. And that tells me that they really don't have a clear picture of what sustainability leadership looks like broadly, and what responsible action on climate change looks like specifically. So I think we're still in need of that. That's part of the agenda of our Yale initiative on sustainable finance, is to really perhaps move toward driving a mechanism for getting better data into the system and clarifying who's on the right track in terms of the ESG picture they're painting.
All right, I'm going to put a couple of questions together here because people are really trying to get at the mechanics of how this could work. Sort of overarching question is solar and wind enough? If you're talking about going to electric as a primary source of energy for the majority of our infrastructure and our systems, don't you need nuclear? And then when we talk about environmental impact, so when we talk about getting to this net zero state, finding ways to provide energy is one side of it, and finding ways to deal with the carbon in our atmosphere is another side of it. So people are asking, should we be drawing down to reverse desertification? So should we be greening the Sahara? What about solar radiation management, geoengineering? So I'm throwing out a few of these things because, as John says, if people think that we can have an infinite supply of cheap electricity, we will not be successful in achieving a zero emission economy. And we also have to deal with what's already present in the environment.
So let me try to pick up a number of those pieces, Lauren, and you should push me if I miss points that you'd like me to cover. First, I do think the bottom line answer to the pathway to a clean energy future is to have a portfolio approach. I don't think we should bet on any single strategy, any single technology. In fact, I'd like to see a clean energy race, where you put wind power, solar power, but also tidal power, wave power, geothermal power, biofuels, and for that matter, nuclear power and fossil fuels, all into the starting gates. And let's run a test over who can both clean up their power generation structure, eliminate greenhouse gases, and keep costs down. Because the real winner here is low-cost clean energy, not high-cost clean energy. So I think we need a real race among the different power sources. I do think it's an electric future we're headed toward, although some people might argue that hydrogen will play an important role as well. And in that regard, I'm a believer that nuclear at least has a transition role over the next 20 years. I am not in favor of what Germany's doing of shutting down nuclear plants. I think that would be a mistake. I think there's a possibility that new, perhaps smaller modular nuclear reactors with more safety embedded in them could play a role going beyond that. But we do have to address, and every one of these electricity generation potential resources has problems to overcome. Nuclear has to solve its waste issue, and that's a pretty big challenge. By the way, fossil fuels are in my clean energy future race because it would be possible under certain circumstances to imagine air pollution being addressed and carbon capture being developed in a cost-effective enough way that all the greenhouse gases could be sucked out of the burning of fossil fuels and controlled. Again, I don't see that immediately. There's some big hurdles to overcome, but I'm willing to have other people bet on that as an option and invest the money in carbon capture that could make fossil fuels stay in the game. But I do think we need to have all of these elements in the mix. And because it's not clear that we're going to get where we need to go in terms of emissions reduction, you do have to ask the question about carbon capture. Shouldn't we ramp that up? You heard me say yes. And it leads to the kind of final option that's embedded in part of your question, and that is geoengineering, solar radiation management. And I think there is some work being done on that as well. Could we, in some way or another, shield our planet from that solar radiation that's causing the global warming that leads to climate change? And I think there's a lot of folks, including smart folks like Bill Gates, putting money into this. A new book, by the way, by sometime Yale lecturer Wake Smith, I think it's called Pandora's Solution or something like that. The word Pandora is in the title of the book, really exploring geoengineering in a very thoughtful and serious way. And I think we do need to put resources towards this. And I will tell you, when I was first a climate change negotiator in my time at the EPA in the late 1980s through the early 90s into the middle 90s, we were not permitted at that time to talk about adaptation. We were focused only on mitigation. People thought if you talk about the need for adaptation, you'll take your foot off the gas. There'll be a pullback from really committing to reducing emissions. By the 2015 Paris Agreement, we knew adaptation had to be taken seriously. We're already facing risks and harms. And so that agenda is now well embedded in the global conversation. I think we're now starting to recognize, and it's increasingly the case, there's a consensus on the need for investments in carbon capture, in carbon removal. So I do think that agenda is now quite socialized and normalized. But the piece still remaining that a lot of folks don't want to talk about for fear that it would distract us from these other elements or in some way detract from the core problem is this geoengineering. I myself believe we should be investing in that as well, because it may turn out to be quite important if we fall short in our emissions reduction efforts, in our carbon capture efforts.
Okay, a number of people asking about, actually, I just want to answer one question from Christine, who wants to know if we can download the chat, because there's some really fascinating comments coming up in the chat, people expressing their points of view on topics. And I just want to make sure everyone knows I'm focused on the Q&A box, which is where I'm pulling questions from. Any comments that are in the chat, everyone will be able to see, but I'm not pulling questions from the chat comments. To download the chat, you should be able to do that by clicking on the three dots at the bottom of the chat box. Bottom right of the chat box, there are three dots. You can click on that and that will allow you to save the chat. You can also come back and watch this recording on demand, and the chat will be available when you see the on-demand recording.
So Lauren, before you jump on to the next question, I just want to finish that I said, which is Wake Smith, Yale, sometime college lecturer. His new book is Pandora's Toolbox, The Hopes and Hazards of Climate Intervention. So for anyone interested in that geoengineering topic, that's a resource I'd go to.
There you go, Maria. It was Maria, your former PhD student, who asked about that specifically. So I know she's glad to get that answer.
I'm still glad to be able to assign additional reading to Maria.
All right. You asked for it, Maria. Now you've got it. So a number of people, you mentioned Bill Gates a few minutes ago, and a number of people sort of coming to a point that Bill Gates was making about a decade ago, which is that possibly there are just too many people on the planet, or are there? Are there? I mean, what about population growth? How does that figure into these plans that you're describing?
So population growth, of course, was one of the critical issues that really got people thinking about environmental limits in the 1970s. But that whole limits to growth idea kind of fell apart because it wasn't well connected to an alternative vision, which was the power of innovation and the ability to substitute new ideas and products for ones that might be running up against limits. I think we're coming back around to recognizing that it's not probably limits of things like particular minerals that are going to hit us. It's the planetary Earth system's limits that really are at risk. So I do think that we want to watch out for population growth as a driver of the stresses that cause us in unsustainable future potential and climate change risk in particular. But I have to also say that in most places in the world, population trends are now moving towards a relatively flat level. Not everywhere, but Europe is in fact seeing declining population. And in a number of other places, one has to think that the population driver of risk is diminishing. So I still watch it as a concern. It's a concern in some parts of Asia, some parts of Africa. But it's really become much less of a concern in terms of drivers, I think, than other factors, including affluence. I think affluence and people, the same number of people buying more stuff is a bigger threat. And again, one doesn't want to be against affluence. It's a good thing. But I hope that with affluence, we might invest in a dematerialized, more sustainable future where we're emphasizing quality as opposed to always quantity. And we're really looking to create a closed loop economy where we're more careful about not allowing waste to overwhelm us.
Okay, we have just about 4 minutes left, so I want to just take an opportunity to ask you, Professor Esty, if there's any specific points that you want to make sure you make before we close.
I'm happy to take another question or two. You know, the other thing I would say is that we spent a lot of time today focused on climate change and some of the mechanisms I think that are helping to sharpen focus, particularly in the corporate world, on the need to take this issue up. I think there is a broader structure of pathways to a sustainable future that I hope people will be thinking about, including ideas like more of a systems approach to how we do environmental protection, rather than silos of air and water and waste, of the need to be much more attentive to where the money is going to come from. I've mentioned that briefly, but that's a big issue. And for those who want to dive deeper, the Better Planet book that I think has been dropped into the chat. This is, again, the book done by a team at Yale, led the push coming from Dean Indy Burke at the Yale School of the Environment, is, I think, really fun because it's got these 40 different chapters, 40 different concepts, frameworks, ideas for helping us move in the direction we need to go. And they don't add up to a complete picture, but they provide lots of fresh thinking that I think are part of the story about how we get to the sustainable world we all want, and particularly how we respond to climate change.
Okay, I have reposted the Better Planet link for the Better Planet, and also I will repost in just a moment link for Values at Work in case you would like to pick up a signed copy of Professor Esty's latest book, available from the Yale bookstore. We talked about I just answered one question that just came in. By affluence, do you mean consumption? And I think the answer is, more people having more wealth, able to buy more things, creating more things in the environment that have to be ultimately disposed of. Is that correct?
It's just right. So again, I think what we have to hope for is that many pollution issues see something we sometimes call the environmental Kuznets curve, where pollution rises when countries are beginning to industrialize, and then it falls as those countries get wealthier. Greenhouse gas emissions are the one exception to that. They keep seeming to rise and rise, perhaps more slowly. So it doesn't appear that affluence is going to be a solution to some of our problems. And until people really get to the point they're willing to invest some of that wealth in solving the problem of climate change. So I do think a world where more people are buying more stuff and there's more waste, more resources consumed and extracted is part of the challenge.
Okay, I want to give a shout out to Princeton University, since you mentioned that we kind of left them out of these conversations. Maybe next year in our 3rd annual climate change conversations, we will bring Princeton on board. Meanwhile, Richard says that they're working hard at the plasma physics labs there on nuclear fusion, and Sir Stephen Cowley, who's the director, thinks that we will have this by 2050. What is your opinion, Dan?
So I have a worry about fusion because we've been told it's just 20 years away for 50 years. So now being told that it's 30 years away makes me even more worried. And I do know folks that are putting a lot of effort into it. And my view broadly is let's try everything. I'm a big believer in this idea of a portfolio of effort and the high probability that there's not a single silver bullet that's going to provide us the pathway to deep decarbonization, a clean energy future, or a broader sustainable future. So I am totally committed to the idea that somebody should be pursuing this, and if Princeton doing it, all the better.
All right, well, on that note, I'm going to thank everyone for attending. Thank you all for hanging out with us until the end here. This has been an incredible conversation. I'm so sorry if I did not get to your question. I still have about 20 questions that we couldn't answer, but we did as many as we could. I want to thank Professor Dan Esty for joining us again. He joined us last year. Hopefully we'll have you back next year. Dan, in the meantime, go off to the meeting there in Glasgow and make sure that they take our issues and concerns seriously. We need you. We're counting on you.
I will do it. Thank you, Lauren, for providing the opportunity for the conversation today. And thanks to everyone who joined in. Really a great opportunity to have all of us think together about what's required to move forward.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.